All right, thank you all. Good afternoon, staff and students. The motion of today's debate is that studying English is of no practical use. And on the affirmative side, we have the teachers, and on the negative, we have the students. We have Miss Brownhill, Mr. Wynne, and Mr. Marnie arguing for the teachers, and Harvey, Michael, and Louis arguing for the students. Yeah, sorry, Mahoney. I'd first like to welcome Miss Brownhill to open the affirmative team's case.
Good afternoon. We, the affirmative, are going to prove to you beyond a doubt that studying English is a complete and utter waste of your time, that it has no practical bearing on your future success or happiness, and we will offer up ourselves and the pitiful lives we lead as teachers of English as part of that proof. Just look beside me, gentlemen. This bleak existence is the future that awaits you should you decide to pursue further study in English. Pretentious facial hair, bad suits, even worse shirts, attempts at hipster coolness that ever so slightly miss the mark, and vocabulary so vast that everyone just smiles and nods when you speak. Mr. Marnie? Well might your English teacher declare to you, I read, therefore I am. But let us consider the mental health implications of a life dedicated to literary wanderings. What matters most in life, gentlemen? Knowledge? I think not. Wisdom? That hardly seems relevant in the age of Google now, does it? Kindness? Ha. Or is it this? That's right, gentlemen. Donald Trump is a modern-day goddamn Shakespeare. He makes up a word. We all recognize it. Did the Donald study English? The evidence would suggest not. Did he pay any attention when his teachers droned on about syntax, split infinitives, and Wordsworth? No. What really matters in a world where the Donald rules? This. Influence, money, power. So let's ask ourselves, who has influence? Celebrities. Justin Bieber has over 100 million Twitter followers. His lyrics include such deep philosophical statements as baby, 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 oh, and the poetic genius of I might make you mad, so mad. My bad, no, I ain't all bad. And all he needs to do is say something completely innocuous, sans punctuation, and 136,000 people retweet it. This is as complicated as English needs to be nowadays. And you needn't look very far to see how little English is valued in the land of celebrity. So for the sake of comparison, let's just bring the focus back to us for a second. Here is at Blair Marnie. I would have you notice the number of followers, gentlemen. Justin Bieber, over 100 million. Blair Marnie, 61 followers, which is less than half the number of current students he is teaching. Influence, it matters, and so does money. Let me introduce you to Shaq. And I'll read for you. Quotatious. I perform random acts of Shaqness. Boston everywhere. hanging at the At Firehouse Subs family reunion. Like the turkey with extra mayo, they're gooder than mug. But who cares? Shaq was the first player to win NBA Player of the Week in his first week. He has 14.6 million Twitter followers and his estimated worth is 350 million US. And Mr. Win Woodley here? What is his worth? One large student debt, a couple of pairs of hipster boots, and an uncommonly large collection of romantic poetry. And power? We needn't look overseas for examples of those in power for whom English is a wee bit of a problem. May I quote the Honourable Member for Kennedy, Bob Catter. Many times I've gone to bed as a cock-a-doodle-doo and woke up the next morning as a feather duster. And former Prime Minister Tony Abbott? No one, however smart, however well-educated, however experienced, is the suppository of all wisdom. For those of you who need a dictionary to help you with that, a suppository is a small piece of medicated substance, usually conical, inserted in the rectum. One dose of wisdom, please. But seriously, gentlemen, here at MHS, who holds the power? This practical source that we can use to further our lives. Because it sure as hell isn't me. Let us look to one of our leading teachers, a beacon of wisdom, a font of knowledge. Discussion with blank self-discipline and ensuring that he doesn't abuse the use of a device. Informed that it will be a severe hindrance to his learn young if he had to study permanently without a device. And then there's me. And I don't even have the power to control 10L.
So we thank Miss Brownhill for her speech. And just a note about speech times. We'd like to keep it to 5 minutes, so I'll give the speakers a clap at 5 minutes, and then at 5:30 I'll clap them off, and you guys will have to join in and clap them off. So, in saying that, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the negative team, Harvey, to open their case.
I call that one Marnie in the morning. Afternoon, gents. I'd like to preface my arguments with a tip for the students watching. If Mr. Mahoney gets through his whole speech without quoting any poems, I will personally forfeit my entire team. And I'd also like to congratulate Miss Brownhill on managing to keep her feet steady throughout her speech. I'm quite surprised she didn't break into dance, honestly. As for Win Woodley, I'd just like to congratulate him on finding the confidence to actually be part of the debate. Having inferior genetics must make it harder to pretend to be smart. On that note, maybe Mr. Win Woodley's large collection of romantic poetry is to compensate for the lack of any real romance in his life. The topic is that English is of no practical use in schools. Now, I know most of you guys probably don't care about English and would drop it in VCE if it wasn't a prerequisite. But believe me, it is important. It's just a pity that none of the poetry that Marnie forces on his English classes is as important. If you call that practical, sir, I advise you use your obvious copious amounts of money you've made from your 2 breakout books, Poetry Reloaded and Poetry Remastered, to get some serious help. On a real note though, you'd think a guy who calls himself Mr. Marnie deliberately mispronouncing his name would make a bit more. Mr. Money, guys, come on, it was funny. Come on. Now, Miss Brownhill, you teach theatre, but you're not good enough to teach the only theatre class. Oh, sorry. You used to teach theatre, but then you subbed out to have a kid, and you've been benched ever since. I don't think you can dance your way out of that one. We're not Como Special Choir. Actually, I think that's the reason you've lost touch with the importance of your only real subject. You've spent so long convincing yourself that dancing and acting actually mean something that you've lost touch with what actually matters, the ATAR, a score coincidentally unachievable without English. Hell, I wouldn't accept your teaching even if it was any good. I refuse to be taught by anybody not good enough to get into Melbourne High School. Speaking of, Mr. Winwoodley, even me, quite the pessimist, was surprised that it took so little time for you to realise that the bright future MHS promised you was only applicable to medical students. And now you're here. You only lasted 8 years in the real world before giving up. How does it feel to have no hope of getting anywhere in life? But to be honest, I'd have some respect for you if you could just make a decision about your hairstyle. Seriously, it's a simple choice, but when you style your hair 5 different ways for 5 different days, it suggests you care more about your looks than your teaching. But we already knew that. I guess that's why you come to PhilSoc. You know at heart you're not a real English teacher, so you sit silently in T45, failing to grasp even the most basic philosophical concepts, convinced that this makes you an all-rounded, cultured individual. Honestly, English is the most important subject you guys are doing at school. How else will you learn to write essays, give oral presentations, and analyse passages? These are all skills that are used in most, if not all, university degrees. What me and my friends here want is to secure some support for an initiative which involves employing the school's first ever actual English teacher. Hopefully today's confrontation will enlighten the school administration to the buffoons that are currently employed as English teachers. I mean, look at Mr. Mahoney. His thing is literature, but he doesn't teach it at VCE. He's upstaged in the philosophy department by Mr. Barham, of all people. I will say, at least he does his nails the best in the school. Maybe you should teach beauty and cosmetics, sir. We, as a student body, really need to have higher expectations of the faculty. We cannot allow teachers like these to lead us down dark pathways of which there are no return. We must make English great again. I'm sure Mr. Winwoodley is going to try and make fun of me struggling to formulate a sentence during PhilSoc meetings. This goes to show that English is not being taught well at the school. If I can't talk about morality to some year 9s, then the school really needs to up their game. Thank you, students.
Thanks, Harvey, for your speech. We'd now like to welcome Mr. Wynne to continue their case.
Hello, gentlemen, colleagues. Before I proceed, contrary to what Harvey just said, a girl smiled at me on the train the other week. And I blushed and ran away. Now, My argument has three parts. The study of English should provide you with these three things: the ability to write and speak coherently. Now, given that Harvey's rambling argument was barely comprehensible, was clearly written on the train this morning, and displayed the critical thinking skills of an SLC/PE teacher, I truly believe I could take my seat now. He has done my job for me. But as you know, I love the sound of my own voice, so I will continue. Coherence, increased productivity, and the ability to think critically. My argument is simple. Studying this has not helped any of you with any of these things. You should give up now, quit school, go into the real world. It doesn't help. So let's talk about coherence. English language, the subject that people who don't like to think critically or creatively take, defines coherence as a coherent text is one that can be understood. Now, the fact that this needs to be spelled out should tell you everything right now. It makes sense and is logical, and the ideas presented in the text are related to each other. Statements lead to examples, questions lead to answers, and problems have solutions. Your writing does not do any of these things. Now, I could use Lewis's quasi-intelligible and embarrassingly for him, nationally broadcast Q&A appearance as an example of incoherence, but it's a busy time of the year for Miss Mill, and the Wellbeing Office has asked me to lay off. So instead, I will pick on you all anonymously. Let's hear from this budding philosopher. Perhaps the argument most vulnerable to disapproval by the determinists is that only human actions are causal. If the human mind is simple enough to be manipulated by prior events, why aren't animals subject to determinism? Humans only being affected is highly illogical. Take this, for example. Everything is made up of matter. Matter is something that takes up a certain amount of area for a certain amount of time. Let's just say, due to determinism, Frank is supposed to stand in a certain place, in a certain farm, at a certain time. As he is making his way there, a pig decides to have a nap at the same spot. What happens according to determinism is Frank will stand inside the pig and the universe will implode. But in reality, Frank will decide to stand somewhere else, perhaps beside the pig. And then there is this brilliant, eye-opening take on Othello. Othello's death, apologies to Year 9s, is caused as a result of historical events occurring at the time Othello was written. So as we see, statements lead nowhere, questions birth further questions, and the problem is the essay and the solution a second or third bottle of wine. If you'd like to see this in action with spoken discourse, drop by Philsock sometime and watch Harvey attempt to convene a session. Now, what about productivity? You'd think that, studying English, you should become much more productive. And the gods of the student-teacher debate have smiled upon me today and put Michael Hilton in my sights. Now, he's studying English and literature, so he should be twice as good, yet there he sits. So despite a well-intentioned desire to immerse himself in the study of English, Michael's lack of productivity has managed to offend me this year on both a personal and spiritual level. Now, lest you think me too cruel, he is a man of many talents. Well, two. He's a CUO in cadets, which my Year 9s told me stands for Childish Unusual Ogre. Now, nobody can take bright, creative children and force them to walk in straight lines until they cannot think for themselves anymore, as well as Michael can. And he was a magnificent Fagin. Nobody can manipulate vulnerable children into working for his street gang like Michael can. One talent. Michael has one talent. And one dark secret. Show of hands, who knows what Sentinel is? Oh, does it exist anymore? That's where you're wrong. Michael is the editor of Sentinel. Now, despite all this time writing and reading and thinking, I don't know, about words and literature and writing, he's not been able to sell a free magazine to a captive audience. Finally, critical thinking. And that's the opposite of practical for you guys. You don't need it. You don't need the existential, from an existential and emotional standpoint, you don't need to think critically. Practically, most of you only need to be barely conscious of your existence. Barely conscious cogs in a machine. Imagine if you realized 20 years down the track that all the most important decisions in your life were made for you by your parents. What course you're getting into, what job you're going to do, who you marry, where you live. You don't need to think about that. It's soul-crushing. So practically, you are all better off not studying English, not learning to be critical thinkers. Stay asleep. Do not learn to read closely. Stay unconscious, happy, and practical.
Thank you, Mr. Wynne, for your speech, and we now call on Michael to continue the case of the negative.
Good morning, staff and students. Afternoon, close enough. The defects of our English department sit before us. But let's start off with a redhead joke. What do gingers miss most about a great party? The invitation. Leaving Mr. Wynne Woodley's genetics aside, it's time to return to the pressing point that studying English is practically useful. But at Melbourne High, the lack of competent teachers makes it very, very challenging for students to perform well in English. After all, you all know that teaching standards at this prestigious high school are slipping when Mr. Mahoney can't even pronounce his own name. It's Mr. Mahoney. However, although he is unable to pronounce his own name, he is renowned for his ability to induce sleep in his philosophy class. Our English teaching has clearly not improved over the past decade since Mr. Wynne Woodley arrived at this school. After graduation in 2008, he was so inadept at academic prowess that he chose to make his career in teaching students how to not be able to read and write. Since he failed to become an English teacher, he became an English language teacher. Now, he even failed at that. We all know that the best English language teachers teach 3-4, but he only teaches 1-2. Even worse than being unable to teach, he can't even come up with original roasts for me. He was forced to go to a Year 12 literature class and ask them if they had any dirt on me. Speaking of Mr. Wynne Woodley, what do gingers look forward to later on in life? Grey hair. Are you a bit envious of Mr. Mahoney over there, Mr. Wynne Woodley? With such abysmal teachers, there is no wonder our English faculty is woeful. Students are forced to endure the pain of listening to Mr. Mahoney's Neanderthalic noises. It seems that between not teaching, some young male teachers have been spending a lot of time together. Mr. Mahoney, Wynne Woodley, Crockett, and Bryant spend so much time together that we're starting to question their orientation and worry that their teaching standards are slipping. Perhaps this is the real reason why Mr. Money and Big Mr. Woody over here think English has no practical use. They're so caught up in their bromance that they've lost focus. So last year, I had to struggle through Mr. Mahoney's teaching. Think of that. Wondering for a whole year if he spent more time finding his poem of the day than preparing to teach a class. The greatest achievement of his teaching career is, without a doubt, his ability to rock up at least 2 minutes late to every form assembly, and yet still give out more detentions for lateness than any other teacher. He must feel like teaching is a form of torture. I must say that many of my classmates last year found it torturous to write 12,000 words of comparison about books they had never read, only to be assured that this was the best way to learn and that SparkNotes would never provide us with enough information. But still, I know that those who read the SparkNotes rather than actually reading the books perform much better on the exam. Interestingly enough, I was looking at Mr. Mahoney's comparative guide of 1984 in Swaziland and the character maps, and they look remarkably identical to the ones off SparkNotes. I think it's time for another ginger joke. What do you call a ginger at a party? Unwelcome. Another symbol of MHS high teaching standards is the lovely Miss Brownhill, predominantly known for bragging about receiving a 50 in English and a 49 in theatre studies. I think it goes to show that people who achieve less in real life seem to remember their school days more fondly. She clearly wasn't taught in Mr. Mahoney's sleep school. Let's face it, with English teachers like this, it's no wonder people question the value of English. However, if you've never listened to one of Dr. Stiglitz's riveting talks, English has to be in one of your top 4, and it is therefore critical to receiving your 99 HR to get into medicine. Or maybe to actually being smart and becoming a good English teacher, unlike these. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your speech, and we now call on Mr. Mahoney to close the case for the teachers.
Thank you. In many respects, it's a triumph for the negative team that they simply showed up today, which is more than they've done for most of their classes this year. I've taught all 3 of these students, and I must say, I kind of hold myself responsible for the way that they've turned out. It is quite evident from the way that they've debated today that they have, in fact, learned nothing of any practical use from their English classes, and that's all down to me. So, shut up, Harvey. We've already heard how plenty of rich and powerful people have obviously not been adept in the use of English, and how the study of English is of little use in the bleak and miserable lives that lie ahead of most of you. I, however, want to concentrate on the poor advice that lies in the actual text that we, I was going to say teach, but inflict on you in your English classes. So let's look at some of the texts that we actually study at Melbourne High. Is there anything there that could actually be construed as practical? The dystopian novels that we teach at Year 11 and Year 12, The Handmaid's Tale in 1984, they could perhaps be seen as useful guidebooks for the coming Trumpocalypse and advice on how to survive it, right? But look at you guys. I can't see any of you becoming handmaids. And all 1984 has to tell you is that any attempt to rebel will inevitably fail. And even if you toe the line, you'll end up being tortured in the Ministry of Love, which is broadly analogous to doing all of your homework in English, writing those study guides for me, and still having to write 3 essays in 3 hours on your English exam. How about Shakespeare? He's often seen as the repository or suppository of all wisdom. Yet that guy hands out bad advice like that friend who convinced you to do English language because it would be easier. And then you end up with Mr. Wynne Woodley. Or let's go to Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. This line from Hamlet is often taken to be good advice, but it's delivered by the notorious windbag Polonius, who sells out his own daughter in order to spy on Hamlet. The son who he gives this advice to takes it to heart so much that he rashly attacks Hamlet and brings about his own death. Turns out that if your own self is a dickhead, then it's not such a good idea to stay true to that self. Although maybe that is actually practical advice for the negative team, as it turns out. Shakespeare is also the guy that suggests it's a great idea to secretly marry your 13-year-old girlfriend. If you were hoping to get some practical life tips from Romeo and Juliet before going to the formal, then you're looking in the wrong place. And if you're looking for anything of practical use in your English class beyond a convenient place to have a nap before your maths test, then you'll also be sorely disappointed. How about Twelfth Night? We teach that at Year 9. Any practical advice in there? Well, there's the line, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. It's the kind of thing that sounds superficially coherent, but actually makes very little sense, like most of the essays that I've read by any of these 3 students. I mean, plenty of you guys think you're going to achieve greatness by getting an ATAR in the high 90s. And no doubt our current accidental Prime Minister, ScoMo, feels like he's had greatness thrust upon him. But all it's really saying is that people achieve greatness in different ways. And Shakespeare doesn't have any practical advice for how to deal with inevitable failure, like, say, you happen to be a member of the negative team. But wait, I hear you say. Surely there are a couple of texts that get used in the English classroom that are extremely practical, and those texts are Poetry Reloaded and Poetry Remastered. Believe me, I hear you. But I'm sorry to say that as wise as the author of these texts is, even he couldn't convince anyone that poetry is practical. In your future careers, you won't find yourself suturing up a wound in iambic pentameter or closing that big business deal with a nice bit of alliteration. No, poetry is pretty much useless, like all of the good things in life. There's no money in poetry, but neither is there any poetry in money. And I actually know which one I prefer. I'm on the side of the impractical and useless, which is why I'm happy to be an English teacher.
Thank you, Mr. Marnie, for closing the teacher's case, and we'd like to invite Louis up to close the student's case.
How am I communicating to you right now? How am I doing it? I'm not playing charades. I'm not speaking Swahili. I'm not performing an interpretive dance. I'm not painting a canvas to express my emotions, nor am I delivering a message to you via carrier pigeon. I am speaking English. Now, even if this isn't the most practical forum, and we are talking about practical uses, it's still the most practical way to get my superior points of view across to you, the doting audience. Imagine if I had to try and express myself as brilliantly and succinctly as I am right now via the use of Neanderthal-like grunts and gestures. You've evidently just been given a demonstration of what this looks like by the opposing team, and you can clearly see that it's not very practical nor effective. Language skills improve our communication drastically. They allow us to specifically articulate the exact things we want to say, unless, of course, that is, you're writing poetry. Something that one of the panelists is, for whatever contrived reason, a fan of. He knows poetry is considered so unpopular and diluted by his students that not only does he write a poorly named poetry textbook, Poetry Reloaded, but he also forces his students to listen to his curated poetry selections every single lesson in what is clearly a desperate attempt to convert his students to the wonderment of poetry. Less practical iterations of English aside, it overwhelmingly allows us as a society to better understand each other and communicate with each other more easily and effectively, to gain a greater understanding of the world, that is, unless you are unfortunate enough to endure even one lesson with one of the representatives of the Melbourne High School English faculty. The best example of how English is of no practical use is illustrated by these shining individuals. Whether it be through straining meaning out of the antagonist's brother's ex-girlfriend's neighbour's shade of pink on her dining room chair, or just introducing us to poetry, the teachers of the MHS English faculty are clearly trying to make English appear to have no practical use to their intellectually starved students. But don't let a few rotten eggs spoil the harvest. Maybe I would have got this saying right if I actually had a competent English teacher. Studying English has a world of practical uses and benefits. You are simply being shortchanged by the teachers teaching you this wonderful subject. As they ignore curriculum in favour of personal vendettas to get you to like poetry, amongst other crimes, your English education suffocates, and you will feel dismayed with the state of your English education. I feel your pain. I feel your suffering. I stand with you, the hopelessly confused crowd, forced to write an essay on a book you didn't read. You're tired, you are withered, and you didn't read the book you were meant to write an essay on because your English teacher kept on reinforcing how little your study score means in the grand scheme of things, whatever that means. I get it. You want to get something out of your English education, something practical, something useful. And you can't see the link between writing about the 17th century form of McCarthyism and helping you do anything useful. But have faith, my peers. It is worth it if you can peer through the Venetian blinds of life and see the illiterate masses who envy your mastery of the English lexicon. You will be richer, happier, smarter, more fulfilled, and get a free set of steak knives if you study English. Despite all their shortcomings, your English teachers are at least meant to provide you with a solid grounding in our language that will help you to be more employable, gain a better understanding of the world, and to express yourself betterer. And if your teachers can't do this, do it for yourself. Read your own books, write your own essays, perform your own persuasive oral pieces to your pet budgie. Don't allow the left-wing ideologues of the MHS English faculty to destroy your passion for English and plague you with their state-sanctioned lefty indoctrinations. They want you to make the right choice as opposed to the right choice, if you know what I mean. I say stuff 'em. Make your own choices. Go on, vote for One Nation if you really want to. Take a cue from your political leaders in Canberra. Launch a revolt against your English teachers and tell them that you will vote for Pauline Hanson unless they start teaching you proper English classes. Because that's the only thing these people fear. An angry, ill-tempered, incoherent redhead. Sorry, not this one, but Pauline Hanson, thank you. Yeah. I will end by saying this. You would be a complete wreck without your knowledge of English. You use it every day, and studying it only makes you better at it, benefiting you and your greater society. So don't let the other mob tell you otherwise. Study English. Thank you.
get a quick verdict. We've got a student and a teacher judge here. Quick verdict on the debate before you go. We get one? Yeah, you don't agree.
Applause-o-meter?
Okay, we'll go on applause then. A round of applause if you think the student team won today. And a round of applause if you think correctly that the teachers won today.